Okay, so this week we're going to be, I think, learning a really interesting midrash that's brought in the Iyun Yaakov, as a kind of an explanation that he brings for the Gemara in Yevamot that I'd like to learn. So we're going to learn this Agadata in Yevamot, and then this midrash from Vayikra Rabbah, and then talk about the midrash and why it could be. I think it's interesting because it talks a lot about why we should believe in Judaism and why we should believe that we have, the true tradition, and then see how the Iyun Yaakov uses our sugya to come up with kind of a brilliant explanation on that medrash. So first, let's look at the Gemara in Yevamot Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph, which is found in the Iyun Yaakov. So it's discussing what we talked about last week around how Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai have a halachic disagreement about if a person dies and then, without children, and the brother can't marry his wife because they're related, but what about the co-wives? We talked about it last week, but for now there's an instance where Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagree with each other, right? So the Gemara comes and says, Ubeplugta de v'Rav v'Shmuel, and there's a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel about this. De Rav omer lo asu Beit Shammai kedivrehem, u'Shmuel amar asu. So they disagreed about what Beit Shammai did, right? Because we're all familiar with the story, which actually brought down here in the Gemara in Eruvin. We'll read it quickly. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Shmuel, Shalosh shanim nechleku Beit Shammai u'Beit Hillel, halalu omrim halacha k'motenu, v'halalu omrim halacha k'motenu. Right? For 3 years, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai argued with each other. Each side said the halacha is like us. And then after 3 years, Yatzah bat kol ve'amra, Elu ve'elu ve'elu chayim, v'halacha k'Beit Hillel. Right? So they're both emes, or truth, but the halacha is like Beit Hillel. So that's what the Gemara in Eruvin says, right? At some point, this bat kol came out and decreed the halacha was like Beit Hillel. So the question is, did Beit Shammai then go and practice according to Beit Hillel? Right? If the halacha had been established like Beit Hillel, so did Beit Shammai continue to hold like them, or did they then go and say, okay, this is our thought, but we're going to follow what the halacha is kovea? So it's a machloka between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said that Beit Shammai did not do according to their opinion. In other words, they did according to Beit Hillel. Shmuel says no, they continued to do according to their opinion. So the Gemara asks as follows and says, "Ve'asu emat." When you say that they did according to their own opinion, when, right? Like emathai, when are you referring to? Ilem akodem bat kol. So if you say it's before the halacha was decided according to Beit Hillel, my time elamanda amar lo asu. So if you say that this discussion is from before the halacha had been established like Beit Hillel, so what is the reason according to the one who said that Beit Shammai did according to Beit Hillel? Why would they listen to Beit Hillel if the halacha hadn't been established yet like Beit Hillel? But if you say that the discussion is about after the bat kol and after the halacha had been established like Beit Hillel, my time the mandam adasu. So why would Beit Shammai then still hold according to their own opinions and not hold according to the halacha which had been established according to Beit Hillel? So the Gemara answers and says as follows: So you can say that the discussion of Rav and Shmuel could be either before or after this bat kol emanated, or the halacha had been established like Beit Hillel. How can you say that? So Ibayit ema kodem bat kol uchagon de Beit Hillel ruba leman de amar lo asu. Okay, so if you say it's before the bat kol came out, okay, and so the halacha had not yet been established like Beit Hillel, so then according to the one who said that Beit Shammai still did it like Beit Hillel, you could say it's because Beit Hillel was the rov. Right? So even before the bat kol came and said halacha was like Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai still listened to Beit Hillel because they were the majority. V'ha Beit Hillel ruba. Right? Uman de amar asu, and according to the one who said that Beit Shammai practiced according to their own thing, so kiazlinan bata ruba, heicha dechi hadadi ninhu, hacha Beit Shammai mechadede tfei. This is the specific point that's going to become interesting for us later on. So if you have Beit Hillel as a rov, so why would the other opinion say that Beit Shammai still practiced according to their own opinion? And so what the Gemara says here is that when we say that you follow the rov in halacha, that's only when the two sides are equal to one another. Okay? But hacha Beit Shammai mechadede tfei. But we know that Beit Shammai is more chad, sharper, smarter, more intellectual. So they don't have to listen to the rov, right? Even though they're a minority, since no bat kol had yet come and said you have to listen to Beit Hillel, so they still were able to follow their own opinion because they had reached that through their own svaras or tradition, and they were smarter than Beit Hillel, so they didn't have to listen to them. Okay? Or you can say this discussion is after the bat kol came out. Okay, man damar lo asu. So then, according to the one who said that Beit Shammai did according to Beit Hillel, so it's obvious why. To hanafka bat kol, because the bat kol had emanated and said you have to listen to Beit Hillel. Man damar asu, but according to the one who said that they still practiced according to themselves. So how could that be? Rabbi Yeshua damar ein mashgichim bebat kol, right? Because if we recall that famous story where Rabbi Eliezer is put to cherem and has a whole argument with the rest of the rabbis. So we end up saying, Rabbi Yeshua says, Lo b'shamayim, we don't care what the bat kol says, right? And so Beit Shammai can say, I don't care if this bat kol came out and said the halacha is like Beit Hillel, we're still going to follow our opinion. And so that's what they did. So that's the Gemara. I have it here summarized kind of in a table. But the basic idea is that there's 4 different ways to understand this. What's important for us is that according to one of the opinions, this is really all that matters for us, is that there is an opinion that says that Beit Shammai practiced according to themselves and didn't follow Beit Hillel even before the bat kol had come out. And the explanation given by the Gemara is that we only follow a majority if the two sides are equally matched, but Beit Shammai had a sharper intellect, so they had the right to still continue and follow in their own opinion. Okay? So that's our Gemara. So the Iyun Yaakov takes that idea. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going, well, why is this a question just on Hillel and Shammai?
This idea of Mechadedi Tfei? What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like you could ask the same question on any mafloga on Shas, couldn't you? Like why?
Right. So yeah, I don't think we actually accept this concept of Mechadedi Tfei lehalacha. I could be wrong. I didn't actually look too deep into it, but you're right. In theory, anyone could say, "Oh, I'm smarter than everybody else, so I can just follow my own logic." Right. And maybe this is used to say sometimes the reason why, like, halacha is always established according to the majority, but we still record the minority opinions, because maybe later on in the evolving of halacha, you'll need to rely back on minority opinions to kind of establish new halacha. But to your question, it's something I'm not too familiar with from like halachic process perspective, like why we have this concept, but in general we say you follow the rov. Perhaps the thing we would say is, in general, who decides who's mechadedei tfei? Like, who decides that someone is sharper than somebody else, right? For Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, we can make a statement like that, because Beit Shammai were known to be really, really intelligent, I guess, or really chad. But in general, for a random machloket, you can't just decide that one side is more mechad than the other. But I don't know, it's a good question. I'd have to look more into it, for sure. Okay. Sorry if that wasn't so satisfactory.
Yeah, it was.
Okay. So now let's learn the medrash brought by the Iyun Yaakov, and then we'll learn the Iyun Yaakov. Okay? So the medrash is in Vayikra Rabbah, and it says as follows: Amar Rabbi El Aseh. So this rabbi taught. Goy echad she'al Rabbi Shul ben Karcha. Okay? Ktiv b'toratchem achrei rabim lahatot. So this non-Jew comes to Rabbi Shul ben Karcha to, and this happens a lot in the midrash, to kind of cause a fight, right? To pick a fight, like a heretic. He says, your Torah says, Achrei Rabim La'atot, you have to follow the majority. Anu merubim mikem, mipnei ma ein atem mashvim imanu v'avodah zarah. So we are more numerous than you. So how can you not join us in worshiping avodah zarah? Okay? So the non-Jew says, if you look at the world, there's a lot more non-Jews than there are Jews. There's a lot more pagans than Jews. And you yourselves admit that the majority is what should be followed. So Judaism is a minority. So why don't you join us and worship avodah zarah? That's what the non-Jew asks. Okay? So Rabbi Shul ben Korcha responds as follows. He says, Amar lo, yeshcha banim? Do you have children? Amar lo, hizkartani tzarati. You have reminded me of my sorrow. Amar lo lama. So he said, why? Amar lo harbe banim yeshli. The non-Jew says, I have a lot of sons. V'shah she'en yoshvin al shulchani. And when they all come home to my house to eat at my table, zeh mevarach le'elokei ploni. Zeh mevarach le'elokei ploni. So this one, right? They're doing hamotzi, or they're saying grace, whatever. So this one says it to that God, and this one says it to that God, and this one says it to that God, and the meal doesn't end until they've all driven each other crazy, or beat each other up. So Amar lo mashveh atay mahen. So Rabbi Shimon says, do you do that with them? And he says Amar lo lo. He says no, because they're all praying to different gods. So Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says, Amar lo, ad she'ata mashveh otanu lech hashveh et banecha, nidchaf ve'alach lo. So Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says, before you come to us with an argument about how we should follow the pagans, first clean up your own house, right? First sort out which god you guys want to follow. All right, then you can come with tainas against us. So the non-Jew was embarrassed and he left. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Shua said to the non-Jew. Kevan sheyatsa amru lo talmidav. When he left, his students said to him, Rabbi, lazeh dachita b'kaner atzutz lanu ma ata meshiv. So this is actually also something that happens in Midrash, not infrequently. The students say, okay, you pushed him away with some answer, but it's not the real answer. Right? What are you going to tell us? The student's like, what's really the answer to the question? Right? And so then he gives a strange response. Amar lahem, Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says, Be'esav k'tiv be. Shesh nefashot, uchtiv bo nefashot harbe. Okay, so by Esav, the pasuk says on the one hand 6 souls, but it also says the word nefashot in the plural. Tichtiv, the pasuk says, Vayikach Esav et nashav et banav et benotav et kol nafshot beito. Okay, so Esav took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all the nefashot in his family. I guess there that's numbered as 6. So nefashot is the number 6 people is referred to as souls. Uviakov shivim nafesh uchtiv bei nefesh achat. But by Yaakov Avinu it describes him having 70 souls, but only 1 nefesh. Uchtiv, the pasuk says, Vayikol nefesh yotzei Yaakov shivim nafesh, right? Because we know 70 people went down to Egypt, and it refers to them as nafesh, like 1 soul. What does that mean? Ela Esav shu oved lelahot harbe, ktiv bei nefashot harbe. So Esav, who worships a lot of gods, is referred to as having many souls. Aval Yaakov shu oved leloka echad, ktiv bo nefesh achat, vayikol nefesh. But Yaakov, even though there's many of them, because they all worship one God, they're referred to as having 1 soul. That's the end of the Medrash. Okay. So what does that mean? Like, what is Rabbi Shua ben Karcha getting at here? So I was thinking about this a lot, and I'd like to propose a potential reading of this Midrash as follows. That there's this idea, right, when you think about like logic and philosophy of a syllogism, right, that you have like clear prepositions and then a conclusion, right? The classic example is like Socrates is man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That if you have something that's for sure true and something else that's for sure true, then if you take them together, it leads to a conclusion that you have to accept, right? That's like the way logic works. It's called a syllogism, I think. So if we kind of take that concept and apply it here, the non-Jew is really doing something like this. He's saying the non-Jews are more numerous than the Jews, right? And that's what he says, Anu merubim mikem. So we're a majority and you're a minority. And also, achrei abim la'atot, which means you always have to follow the majority when it comes to questions of religious truth or questions of... In other words, this principle of achrei abim la'atot applies when it comes to understanding what the truth is. And so if you accept those premises, A, that the non-Jews are majority and the Jews are minority, and B, that you have to follow the majority when it comes to religious truth, so then you have to conclude that Judaism is false and that Avodah Zarah is true, right? So Rabbi Shua ben Karcha, in his response to the non-Jew, he rejects the first premise, which is that the non-Jews are a majority, right? Because he says, you're not a majority, because each one of you is worshiping a different God. It's true you're all not worshiping the Jewish God, but it's not as though you guys have a monopoly on like what. It's not as though there's a majority there. It's just fragmented. You're all worshiping different gods. So even if I accept the concept of achrei abim la'atot, the premise that should apply when it comes to what's true, but you're not a majority, so we don't have to listen to you, right? So that's what Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says to the non-Jew. But what is the problem with that? Like, why aren't the students satisfied with that answer? Like, why isn't that good? Right? Why is that not good enough for the students? Any ideas? Thoughts?
It doesn't give like a foundation as to why like Judaism would be true.
Awesome.
Like on its own. Like it should be true on its own, not just because everybody else is. Like this also it sounds like the introduction to the Kuzari, right? Where he says the same thing. They just outright reject like this type of Avodah Zarah just because they're all over the place. But it's not really an answer. There's still like a whole book.
Right. Perfect. I think that's exactly right. In other words, the students will say, right, Lanu mata mishiv. In other words, you're not going to say Judaism is true on a technicality, right? It's like, okay, it's circumstantial even that like the Jews are a minority and there's no majority. But I would even go so far as to say, let's say sometime in human history there is a majority of some other religion. Like what if Christianity becomes the majority of the world, right? Or whatever. Does that mean now that Judaism is false? Like, of course not, right? So that, like Chaim said, that it doesn't give an answer to why Judaism is true. It just gives a way to reject the idea that all these different gods are true. And so that's when Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha has to come and give a different answer. And so I think his second answer is rejecting the other premise, right? Not that the Jews are minority and the non-Jews are majority, but that this principle of Acharei Rabim La'atot applies to religious truth. He says, who says that's the case? Right? K'tiv b'toratchem Acharei Rabim La'atot. That's true for halacha. Fine, you have some halachic situation. You don't know what the rule is, so you go to judges and then you follow the majority. But whoever said that the metaphysical truth of God's existence and the fact that He chose the Jewish people and gave them the Torah has anything to do with that idea, right? That's something that is beyond philosophy, beyond discussion and debate between the majority, right? Like the majority has no relevance here. This is a truth that is not related to that. So I think I'm trying to read that into Rabbi Shua ben Karcha's response, which is kind of esoteric, but right, he says here that basically Esav, which obviously represents the non-Jews, they have a lot of different souls, but the Jews have one soul. And what that means is there's a lot of different Jews, but they worship one God. That's it, right? Like Moshe Emet v'Torato Emet. And we're not fractured the way that the non-Jews are fractured, in the sense that we have our truth, and Tzadik be'emunato yichya. That the foundation of Judaism is not up for discussion or debate. It's just it's a received truth that we have. So basically, in that sense, he's rejecting the conclusion that Judaism is false by saying that it's not subject to the majority or the minority opinion. It's something that is not even in that discussion. So just to kind of summarize again, so the way we frame this is that there's like two premises here, that if you accept them, you have to conclude that Avodah Zarah is true. A, that the Jews are a minority and the non-Jews are a majority. And that B, you have to follow the majority when it comes to stuff like this. And so first he rejects the idea that the non-Jews are a majority, because he says it's not true, you're all over the place. But then he says that's not really the answer, because first of all, it's not like a fundamental reason. And even if things change, it's not as though we would now go and accept Christianity, even though it's much more numerous. Right? If anything, it's the opposite, because the Torah says in Devarim, Hashem, right? Hashem, in I think Parshat Vaychanan, it says Hashem chose the Jews not because they're numerous, but because they're small, right? Ki ha'me'at mikem mikol ha'amim, or something like that. That's why God chose us. Great. How does this relate to? So what does the Iyun Yaakov do with this? So now the Iyun Yaakov says as follows. Iyun Yaakov is not in Sefaria, so I have to screenshot it. But basically he says, if we zoom in here, okay, he says, Dechi azlinan bataruba. Eicha dechi hadadade ninhu, hacha Beit Shammai mechadei tfei. So he's commenting on what we saw earlier, that Beit Shammai didn't have to accept Beit Hillel's opinion because they were mechadei tfei, they were sharper. So now the Iyun Yaakov says, V'al pi zeh efshar letaretz kushiyat haymina b'midrash Parshat Vayikra, Tichtiv Acharei Rabim La'atot, V'hem Ruba. Okay, so based on this, perhaps we can give an answer for the question of the non-Jew in the Medrash that we learned together, where he asks, doesn't the Torah say Acharei Rabim La'atot, and the non-Jews are the rov, so you have to follow the non-Jews. So the Iyun Yaakov says, what can we do? We can use this response given for Beit Shammai and apply it. L'fi she'enu anu mechadedei tfei, ki hi chochmatchem v'gomer. Right? So the Iyun Yaakov says, even if I accept that the non-Jews are a majority, and even if I say that Acharei Rabim La'atot is something that I have to follow, and Acharei Rabim La'atot is the principle of follow the majority, even if I would say that applies when it comes to religious truth, we still don't have to accept what the nations are doing. Why? Because we're mechadedei tfei. We're smarter than they are. Right? And how do we know that we're smarter than they are? Because the Torah is the Torah is what makes us, wise. So if we're smarter and better, I would even say is being implied here, than the non-Jews, so it's almost a different answer than Rabbi Shua ben Korcha gives. He's giving like a third answer, right? He's saying, I can even accept all the premises and still not have the conclusion. Because I can say, okay, you go and do your Avodah Zarah, but we can still worship, we can still hold our minority opinion because we know that we're right. Just like Beit Shammai would say, we still hold to our minority opinion, even though Beit Hillel is the majority, because we know that we're right. So he's giving a totally different answer that could still technically give a response to why we would still follow Judaism. So the Ein Yaakov continues and says, okay, and this also explains what's brought in a different midrash. That there's a midrash that quotes a pasuk, and it says, and it uses that pasuk to explain why the Torah Sheba'al Peh had not been given in writing, but rather had been given orally, right? Because they were afraid that if it had been given in writing, then it would be copied. But if you're saying that you don't want it to be copied and you want it to be passed on orally, so then why was the Torah Shebichtav given in writing? Right? Right? You should also be afraid that that's going to be copied by the other nations. Right? So if you're afraid the Torah Sheba'al Peh is going to be copied by the nations, and that's why it was given orally, so why wouldn't you apply that logic to the Torah Shebichtav, which, as we know, has been copied by the nations? Right? So Ela Vadai de'ikar hachashashu b'Torah Sheba'al Peh. Right? But rather, the real concern in that midrash is only for Torah Sheba'al Peh. Why? Shu ikar hachidud va'pilpul. Because Torah Sheba'al Peh is all about being chad. It's all about being like sharp and precise and intellectually, pushing yourself. Something the midrash Tanchuma b'Parshat Noach. Right, as it's brought there that in the midrash in Tanchuma that Torah Sheba'al Peh is about the chidud and the pilpul. Ulukach nitan ba'al peh l'Yisrael shelo ya'atiku v'yivatlu Yisrael b'nehem beruba. Right, and so it's specifically the Torah Sheba'al Peh that is what maintains the Jewish people as a separate people. Right, because Torah Shebichtav, we're not as afraid if the other nations copy it and write it down, because it's Torah Shebichtav. It's obviously it's still Torah, but the real thing that we're afraid of being copied is Torah Sheba'al Peh, because that's all about the pilpul and the discussion, and that's something that needs to be passed on orally, because that's what sets apart Bnei Israel, because we're Mechadedi Tfei. And so only we are able to maintain it through the oral tradition, and that's important for us so that we don't get, right, Vivatlu Yisrael b'nehem beruba, so that Bnei Israel don't get assimilated into the larger culture. We need that Torah Sheba'al Peh to give us our own unique identity. And so I think the Ein Yaakov is using here this concept of Mechadedi Tfei to give a brilliant explanation for another way, perhaps a third response to the min, in addition to the two that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha offers in the Midrash there. And then also to explain why Torah Sheba'al Peh initially hadn't been written down, but was supposed to be passed on orally, because that's what sets Bnei Israel apart, is that we have this oral tradition, and then that's what ensures our survival amongst the nations. Which is also the point that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha is making at the end of the day. Questions? Thoughts? Okay, so then...
It's true, isn't it?
Sorry?
The Yiddish cup.
The Yiddish cup, right. Yeah. So let's just wrap up. We have 2 or more minutes. So that Gemara in Eruvin that we quoted before, where Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are arguing with each other and which one is true. So just want to kind of read that Gemara because it ends with a nice message, right? So it says, so why did the Bakol say that the halacha was like Beit Hillel if they're both Divrei Elokim Chayim, right? So the Gemara says, "Mipnei shenochin va'aluvin hayu, v'shonim divreihem v'divrei Beit Shammai." Right? V'lo od el shemakdimin divrei Beit Shammai ledivreihem. Right? Because they were pleasant people. Beit Hillel was pleasant people. They were people who got insulted versus insulted others. Right? And they would teach both their opinion and the opinion of their opponents. They didn't just teach their opinion. And more than that, they would actually first say what the other people thought and then say their own opinion afterwards. Right? And then it gives an example, which you can skip. And then the Gemara concludes from that, "L'lamdecha shekol hamashpil atzmo HaKadosh Baruch Hu magbiho, v'chol hamagbiah atzmo HaKadosh Baruch Hu mashpilo." Right, so that teaches you that anyone who lowers himself, God raises him up. But anyone who raises himself up and is arrogant, God brings him down. V'kol hamechazer al hagdula, hagdula borachat mimenu, v'chol haborach min hagdula, hagdula mechazeret alav, acharav. Okay, and anyone who chases after greatness, greatness runs away from him. Anyone who runs away from greatness, greatness chases after him. Same idea. Basically, this concept that the reason Beit Hillel were chosen for the halacha, and this is a really interesting point, with this we'll finish, is not because they were the majority. Right? We said Beit Hillel was the majority, but that's not why the Bat Kol came and chose the halacha according to them. So even here, the Acharei Bin Latot isn't the reason why Beit Hillel is chosen. The reason why they're chosen is because they taught Derech Eretz, and they were good human beings, and they were always deferring to the other side and making sure that the other side's opinion was heard. And so that was why they deserved to have the halacha brought according to them. Decided according to them. That's it. Shkoyach. Thank you.
Shkoyach, Ron.
Everyone's on mute. Yeah.